Great, I can see your PowerPoint there. Perfect, and I'll let you go, Thomas.
All right, so kind of as Neil said there, my name is Thomas O Shaughnessy. I work at the University of Limerick. At the moment, I kind of wear many hats, but I'm the Assistant Technology Officer. I also kind of chair our university's web accessibility group. I kind of guest lecture on areas like UDL, accessibility and assistive technology in courses like teacher education, instructional design, and kind of speech and language therapy, that kind of area. Me and my colleague Conor Hartigan, we set up the Educational Assistive Technology Centre at the University of Limerick. I'm also a PhD candidate looking at assistive technology under the kind of umbrella of UDL in initial teacher education. And I guess I've always come kind of from a disability background, but I've been really interested in terms of UDL and kind of higher education at the moment, and that's kind of a lot of what I've been looking at. And at the moment, I'm kind of looking at it under the umbrella of accessibility. So the kind of idea behind the presentation today is just kind of highlight the kind of changing educational landscape in Ireland in terms of accessibility and UDL, to kind of highlight the interconnected intrinsic relationship that exists between accessibility and UDL, and to kind of demonstrate the importance of accessibility in all aspects of education. And that's one that I'm really kind of passionate about at the moment. I'm going to talk about the role of a community of practice that we have and how that impacted teaching and learning, especially during times like COVID. And I'm going to talk about applying a kind of an accessibility lens to a UDL-based lecture. So one of the things that I kind of always talk about first is, you know, communication. And what you have here on the screen is this picture of a camel with camel case written on the back with the C capitalized on case to highlight camel case. You have a barcode that links you, if anybody's in the Padlet app, directly to the Padlet. And you have Mindy Johnson's social media accessibility image, which talks about plain text, camel hashtags, link shorteners, image descriptions, alternative text. And so that's just, I'm trying to do verbal description of what's on the screen. So in terms of the Padlet, what I'm looking at there is I have it open kind of on my second screen, and that's about if anybody wants to put in feedback there, they want to share anything, or if they want to have any sort of discussion there. And if you want to use social media, I'm quite active on social media, so that's my Twitter handle. And if you are using social media to contact me or at me, be sure that you use a kind of accessible practice. And if you don't want to use social media or Padlet or the chat box, you can just send me an email after the session and I'll be happy to get back to you. So in terms of inclusive education in Ireland, one second. Like ahead of highlighted, you know, the growing number of students with disability going into higher education at the moment. And previously we had things like the Disability Act and the Equal Status Acts that have kind of helped support these students. But, you know, in more recent years, we're seeing things like the National Plan for Equity of Access to Higher Education talk about mainstreaming more of these supports. And in kind of September of last year, we saw the European Web Accessibility Directive transposed into Irish law. And it wasn't designed specifically for people with disabilities. And what we're seeing is kind of this natural kind of drift towards more kind of universal approaches. And it's through all our kind of areas of education in terms of how we're looking at inclusion. The NCSE are currently piloting the school inclusion model. We've seen changes in how school resources are allocated to give schools more autonomy and kind of rather than based on kind of more own medical model. And we've had national legislation from 2004 in the Edson Act about, you know, providing kind of more inclusive education in our schools. But what we're seeing in the kind of last kind of 2 or 3 years is this change in attitude, and we're starting to see the permeation of UDL into a range of different kind of Irish educational policies and publications, from primary straight into post-secondary and into initial teacher education. So you have Kelly and Paddington work, you have Quirk and McCarthy, you have Rayner, you have Hicks doing a lot of publications under the NCSE. And one thing that I feel maybe isn't necessarily being addressed enough is this kind of intrinsic link that links between kind of UDL, accessibility, and inclusive practice. So when people talk about universal design or universal design for learning, you know, I always focus in on that universal kind of word. And can we really say anything's universal if it's not accessible? And for me, they're one of the, you can't have universal design if it's not automatically accessible. And if you're making things more accessible, you're automatically more, you know, kind of promoting more inclusive practice. And I think sometimes when people are in such a rush to get onto the UDL bandwagon, they're forgetting about, you know, the inherent accessibility that comes when you're promoting UDL. So one of the things that comes up as well is, you know, I see accessibility or access used in so many different terms. And I had this discussion yesterday with Thomas Tobin about, you know, how people perceive accessibility. And I was NUIG had a really good conference there recently, and a colleague of mine, Tracy Galvin, she did a presentation on a kind of similar topic. And one of the questions she asked straight up from the audience was, you know, what's the word that comes into your mind when you think about accessibility? And for me, I almost froze. Like, for me, it's such an umbrella term, you know, and I'm not referring to, like, you know, the accessibility functional principles, the core thing. I'm referring about how people perceive accessibility. And, you know, it really impacts about how accessibility is seen. You know, one of the things that came up in Tracy's kind of list of the things that people get back to her was just thinking about, you know, preventing exclusionary practices, caring for all learners, you know, inclusivity and supporting diversity. And I guess that comes up a lot in the literature, and I saw that through DeWitt. But one of the people that, like, if you look at people like Eddie Byrne, he talks about this focus and moving away already from accessibility as being, you know, in disability discourse, and moving towards this more universal thing where they talk about accessibility not just being for students with disabilities. But for me, accessibility and it links into disability discourse with kind of everybody that we speak to. And for me, you need to be looking more at stuff like Ahmed and talking about, you know, the celebration of diversity. And for me, that's kind of where we should be placing accessibility in under kind of the EDI approaches that we're taking in higher education. And like Parent also talks about, you know, accessibility really impacts learners of every nationality. So I don't think really we can say, you know, accessibility is disability discourse, or it's a disability related event. Accessibility really now is everybody's business, and I don't think we're in a position where we can really say otherwise. And not just because of the legal ramifications, but of our kind of moral and ethical responsibility to provide accessible content. So, like Roger Shaw talked about this, UDL as being this kind of learner-centered framework that strongly emphasizes the need for accessibility, collaboration, community. I really like this notion of accessibility, collaboration, and community, and I'll talk more about collaboration and community later on. But for me, it's just, you know, put this emphasis on accessibility. And Scott et al., they talk about putting this emphasis on accessibility of learning as well when you talk about UDL. But I go back to stuff again like that Thomas Tobin talks about. He talks about, you know, UDL implying that all electronic material is innately accessible to everybody. And for me, it actually goes beyond just that educational material, that it looks at every kind of facet of what we do in higher education or in further education. And what El-Alwazi talks about is, you know, incorporating this UL approach to increase your opportunities to address potential accessibility related issues. So what he's saying is, by incorporating UDL, you're actually able to address a lot of the accessibility issues that you may already have in your institution. And like, we have to understand as well that, you know, accessibility links across all principles of UDL, whether it's engagement, action and expression, action or expression, engagement or representation. And what I've seen already here in Ireland, sometimes it's this, we're seeing this real promotion of UDL, but I'm seeing a lot of presentations that aren't accessible, even though you can tell that students in the audience or learners in the audience require that accessibility being built. I'm also seeing, you know, publications related to stuff on equality and inclusion that are inaccessible. I also see, like, I saw one university in Ireland recently, they talked about giving a presentation live because the lecturers, some of them were feeling uncomfortable about being recorded, and they were going to do the session live. And I was like, are you going to provide live captions? And they were like, they just didn't even respond. And I'm just wondering, like, so they were going to do a live session to make the lecturer feel more comfortable, but they weren't going to provide the captionings that go with it. So what you're really doing is you're discriminating against a massive group of students who require captionings to interact with material. And, you know, I talk about accessibility in UDL, but even if you take a UDL out of the side, if you're talking about digital equity, that's where you need to be. And so what we're seeing now, and Tandy and Beecham and Peacock and Vecchione talk about how universities now are actually adopting UDL literally as a reason to address accessibility concerns that they have in the university. And I guess that's kind of what I've been doing, using UDL as the benchmark to explain, to push accessibility and move it away from disability course and put it in to kind of our center for transformative learning and say, this is where this should be housed, as opposed to something that still seems to emanate from the disability services. And one of the things that I talk about a lot of late now, and it's how I've been trying to change how we view accessibility with our campus. I talk about this accessibility band, and what you have on here is just an image of an elastic band that says accessibility. But the idea was that you have to think bigger than just digital accessibility. So one of the things I talk is, like, I'm involved in like the adoption of our new virtual learning environment that we're going to have. I'm involved in our web team. I'm involved in our technology enhanced learning kind of community of practice. And I'm involved in other aspects of campus where they're all addressing this thing about accessibility. And for me, like, you have to extend it beyond, you know, just the educational material, because it's great if your VLE is completely accessible, but if the content you're putting up in it isn't. And I know there's solutions like Blackboard Alley and stuff like that can do that, but it's the same with your web. what's the point in investing a lot of money in an accessible web if the content that's going up? And it's just not that, even it's your marketing and communications, it's your PR. It's like you can create the most accessible lecture you want, but if the building that you're putting it in isn't accessible, or the classroom inside that building isn't accessible, then it becomes kind of pointless. And the reason why I always bring up procurement as well, is because in our university, like, you have this thing called cloud governance, which monitors any new technology that's bought. And if you're not GB or compliant, it blocks it and stuff like that. But what isn't there is something that says, is this accessible? So what you can do is you can get someone to create the most unbelievably UDL-based course, accessibly embedded, and they can just introduce a new technology off the bat that, yeah, it passes GDPR compliance, but it's in no way accessible. So what we're doing is we're kind of moving in different, so what you're going to end up with is kind of really disjointed effort across campus where accessibility isn't really joined up. And like, I just think we have kind of a moral and ethical responsibility to make sure that all facets of accessibility are addressed, and not just digital materials, which is where we're kind of focusing at the moment. And like, and we're not even, you know, getting the, I know it's a lot of work to get your VLE, your web and everything up to a certain standard, but that's where we need to be. And yeah, we have the Web Accessibility Directive to monitor us now to make sure that we're compliant. But we have, as I said, a moral and ethical responsibility. If we're talking about really EI that goes beyond kind of tokenism, we need to address accessibility across the border, from buildings to procurement to HR and right into all our teaching and learning material. And for me, the only way that I could really see to kind of get that message out was through a community of practice. And we have one in our campus. Limerick talks about, you know, community practice being the sharing of ideas and problem solving, and that is really a big part of what they've been doing. But one of the things that I found most useful about community practice was this insight from previous experiences. So it's, you know, using my knowledge of working in my very specific area to feed into groups where they wouldn't have that expertise. And what we were seeing in our community practice was people coming from all different backgrounds, able to say what worked, what didn't work, and how we can use that to improve the situation we have. And I always feel, and I've had this discussion with other people, I feel that I'm a bit lucky in the university I work with, because between our academic developers and our educational technologists or learning technologists, we have a really positive, proactive group who literally will go out of their way to help anybody to look up new things. They're always on the cutting, trying to find out how we can improve the service, looking for feedback, using reflection. And I think that's feeding into what is a really rich group that we have within our university. And I think that may bias my view towards community practice. But it's just, especially with COVID struck, a lot of these people really stepped up to the fore and really helped push the community practice into what it is today. So our community practice came out of ways of sharing technology enhanced learning that was happening on campus. And we call it the Learning Technology Forum. And it was created by the person who's now the interim president of our university, Kirsten May. And so it had a specific remit around technology enhanced learning, but the structure of it was from people from all around campus. So you had librarians, ITD, academic developers, education technology, specialist services, you had academics, you had a range of people all feeding back into the system, and it really worked. And when COVID struck, that really started to take off. And so what you started seeing, you've seen the shared practices, people talking to each other about what they're doing, what worked, what didn't work. You saw opportunities for reflection. You started seeing them listen to the student voice about how they could change and how they could improve things. And what they were doing was a lot of UDL-based stuff, a lot of stuff, but not really mentioning UDL terminology. And I saw this kind of community of practice as a way to start pushing the accessibility and push it out there to see how we could get this on campus. So I started creating resources. Second COVID happened, about how you create accessible PowerPoint presentations, Word documents, all that kind of stuff. I created videos for the students as well. And the idea was that these resources would be there, but there would also be opportunities for CPT, so people could ask questions. Because sometimes, you know, watching videos, sometimes you want to ask questions how it applies to you. So this group really gave that kind of opportunity for it. And in that, I used accessibility to link it to UDL. And so the first kind of mention of UDL within that group was me linking it in under the accessibility and seeing how they're interlinked and how the importance of making your content accessible if you want to look at doing more things around UDL. And so what we saw was we started people moving away from that silo mentality where one people are doing one thing and one are doing another. People were openly talking, converging, and there was a real synergy within the group that really promoted and pushed how they wanted teaching and learning to go. And I just think it was one of the best things that I've been involved with now in a long time. And I just think even at the moment now, we're looking at kind of not mainstreaming this community practice, but letting it have more influence on what it does on campus because of how positive and how well it worked during COVID. One of the things that I always do, I talk about creating resources, and I talk about doing CBT, but it's one thing to tell people what to do, but the other thing is practice what you preach. So what I try to do is, I had to deliver a UDL module for a postgraduate course, and what I said, what I'll do is I'll apply an accessibility lens to this UDL just to see exactly what I would have to do, involvement, kind of give me an idea of how much time and effort, and it would be a retrofitting exercise because I'd already delivered this UDL module before. And so what Katie Novak talks about, she talks about starting small, and I think NUIG just mentioned this earlier about this +1 approach, but it also talks about this bite-sized elements on time, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to overwhelm many of the educators. And for me, the natural place for you to start when you're starting small or you're doing that kind of bite-sized elements is to start with bits around accessibility, improving the accessibility of your content. Because I remember being at a lecture there recently. It was someone interviewing for a job in special education. One of the questions related to UDL, and their question was, how do you provide that flexibility? And they were talking about, like, if you want to ask questions. If I have questions in class, sometimes I allow them to shout up the answer. Sometimes everybody has to put up their hand. And each kind of element she described was another way of discriminating against a different group within the class. And she thought the flexibility of giving you different options was helping, but not all of the options she gave were accessible to certain groups. So what she was doing was inadvertently, just by providing the wrong type of flexibility, she was actually discriminating against certain kind of cohorts. And that really kind of resonated with me, and it started getting me thinking about the way people perceive UDL sometimes, and it also got me thinking about the different ways in which we think we're meeting criteria when we're not. So I'm kind of trying to work on stuff like that. So in this instance, what I did is I created this kind of accessibility lens that drew down from the CAS learning guidelines. So I found kind of 8 areas within the lecture that I could create accessible content, and I broke that into kind of 3 smaller segments. So that was about designing the structure for an accessible presentation. It was about accessible electronic material and assistive technology support, and the third option was around accessible kind of options for communication. So when I talk about kind of accessible electronic material and assistive technology support, I talk about using the accessible templates that are already built into PowerPoint. You can do a search when you open up your PowerPoint and literally type in accessible, and it'll bring you up templates that are accessible. Captioning, I could talk all day on captioning. As someone who uses captioning quite a lot, I am really not a big fan of auto captioning. Even the best auto captioning services, I'm not a big fan of, for lots of reasons. And there are a lot of people out there seem to be in agreement. The problem is that accuracy, trying to figure out what's being said, especially when it's key terminology and you're not understanding. And for me, we really need to start looking at more how we provide human-based captioning services or edited captions, because what we're doing now is it's no longer students that are deaf or hard of hearing that are relying on captions. There's research to show that captioning helps with the retention of international students. It can actually help support students with dyslexia. There was a thing in the UK about how it improves reading at a younger age. And what we're seeing now as well, even in terms of COVID, people from socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds who are in areas where necessarily plain volume isn't an option. Having that option to have captions where they can sit quietly and still watch the content is really important. And I think if you have auto captions for and you're trying to decipher what's being said, it just doesn't work. And we all know that if you're in any course where there's a lot of course-specific terminology, it's not going to get that right. And I just turn it off now. I refuse to have any sort of auto captions on. I also look at contrast and fonts, so you're looking at things like WebM, a really good guide for that. Alternative text or descriptions, so you just whether it's Word, PowerPoint, or the web, make sure you describe your images. And one of the things that I tried to do here earlier with the camel case, and you saw with the accessibility band, was do this verbal description of images, which Thomas Tobin does, and I actually really love, because it's just really simple and it's really inclusive. And the idea behind it is that you describe what's on the screen. How many people in your presentation who perhaps use screen readers have the actual PowerPoint presentation up in front of you while you're speaking? It's probably not that common. So it is important that you just keep, and I just think it's an easy way to describe to everybody in the room what's on your slide. One of the things that I like to do in terms of accessibility and kind of, and in terms of UDL is this support documentation for any kind of presentation or lecture that I give is about, showing how they can access text-to-speech on campus, how they can access NVDA, any acronyms that I used in my presentation, references, extra links. So giving them that option to do that background reading, because research again shows that if you allow students to do back reading, they come in, there's less stress and anxiety about the module. They can, and just the benefit of knowing what's being discussed as you're listening just makes it a lot easier for you to interact. I've also been using stuff like, in terms of communication, looking at stuff like Padlet and Mentimeter. So Padlet, I've been using for a long time. We started using that originally a good few years back because we were doing this kind of work with students that are with autism, and you don't necessarily get a high level of engagement. But when we opened up the anonymous Padlet, the feedback we got about the course, about what they liked, what they didn't like, what they wanted changed, it opened up a new world. And ever since then, I use Padlet in all my sessions, and that's why I have it open today. Whether it gets used or it doesn't get used, I always provide that option for people who want to share information, want to communicate, or want to say something that they can do it anonymously rather than put it into chat where you can see their name. The accessibility band, I go back, if you're doing communications, like make sure that that the accessibility of any new software you bring in has that FEPAT statement or has that accessibility statement that states. I remember a lot of people were using a thing called Linowit. Like Linowit has no accessibility statement. It's like a Padlet alternative. There's no accessibility, it has no VPAT. So like as soon as I found it didn't have that, I pulled it, never used it again. So we need to be that kind of rigid in terms of how we assess new technologies. It's not just GDPR. If we say GDPR, we need to say accessibility straight after it. And the other thing that we're seeing a lot of growth is this kind of thing, social media. So we're seeing more social media coming into courses. I've seen it in instructional design. I've seen it in a lot of different areas. And it's becoming more embedded in higher education, and we can't really avoid it. So if we are going to use it, we need to use those accessibility guidelines that I showed you that Mindy Johnson did up. That was on kind of, I think, page 3 of my slides. We need to start doing it, using your camel case, describing your images, using link shorteners, just just making it easier for people to read. And don't change the name of your social media profile, because if you edit it into a fancy text, the screen readers won't be able to read it. Sorry if this isn't in your slides. This is a newer slide that I added. Because so one of the things that has been really influential, I'm glad to see that NUIG were talking about earlier, was the influence of the UDL badge across campus. And for us, that's like UDL has been around for like 30 years now, and it really hasn't been taken hold in our education. I know legislation, there's been a slow, gradual change in terms of inclusive practice and UDL, but it has been too slow. But I think the UDL badge has had such an impact across campus in terms of further education, higher education, about getting people aware of it, the importance of it. And I just think, NUIG talked about the benefits of it earlier, and like I remember doing the UDL badge, and I'm glad that I kind of Daniel, and Kate brought it up about the peer part of it. I absolutely loved the peer part of that, but I also got to get to think about what other people are doing in other universities, and I think that's really important. And even it's funny that Jane mentioned that UDL lunchtime thing. We actually, a colleague of mine, Jess Beasley, she's actually set up a UDL coffee morning, kind of that similar vein where people can discuss it. She's based in our kind of arts faculty. But what we have as well is we are seeing changes, and I think the UDL badge is a big part of it. But we're lucky enough that I work in a university where we had this kind of, the HAF funded these kind of recent strategic projects where we're looking at kind of human captioning. We're looking at a kind of global project that involves multi-university project that looks at text-to speech in Irish. We're looking at work around UDL, and we're also providing this kind of really new kind of like really interesting project to do with students that are deaf or hard of hearing to make their experience in higher education more inclusive. And we're linking in with TUD in Dublin on that. So in terms of the elephant in the room, I'm not sure, how am I on time, Niamh?
Yeah, no, you're okay.
All right, so in terms of one of the things people don't tend to talk about is, and it's the odds of you meeting someone having to do UDL accessibility from scratch from the design phase doesn't happen that often. So what you have is a lot of retrofitting, and we have to understand that retrofitting takes time, it takes effort, and sometimes it takes additional resources. As I mentioned earlier, people talking about UDL and forgetting accessibility, that just won't work. They are intertwined, and we can't have one really without the other. Cost and time, that goes back to the retrofitting, but it also goes to things like captioning. Whether you use human captions or you spend time investing in resources to support edited captions on campus, it still costs money. So in here, you need buy-in from your senior management to provide that kind of support. And we have to look at sustainable models going forward, because as I said, captioning is a great example of something that applies to much more than just students with disabilities. Attitudinal barriers, that links back to accessibility, and it links back to disability. The research shows that, attitudinal barriers towards students with disabilities is still a big issue, and that, I feel a lot of that gets reflected in accessibility too. So for me, that's why I think we need to move accessibility, because I think it lies outside disability discourse anyway, but we need to move it into that, into our mainstreaming teaching and learning philosophy about how we approach these things. I'm glad Claire's here, because the other thing I want to talk about was this kind of management of this UDL and accessibility. I remember being at a head conference a few years back where I never remember her name. She was from the Montfort University, and she was talking about how we have to use this top-down, bottom-up, middle-out approach. And for me, that's really important. You need that senior management. You need that buy-in from the top, promoting UDL, promoting accessibility. And you need a bottom-up because you need that student feedback. You need the students saying what's working and what's not working. And for me, that middle-out, that's based around things like community practice, just sharing of ideas. And I think if you don't have to treat it, if you're missing one of these, I think you're naturally going to fail in a lot of kind of different areas. So for me, for it to work, you have to have top-down, you have to have the bottom-up, and you have to have the middle-out too. So where does that leave us? For me, educators, academic developers, and senior managers all have to understand the clear and inherent relationship that exists between accessibility, UDL, and promoting inclusive practice, especially if we want to start putting in things like our strategic initiatives for universities. I thought NUIG had some really interesting stuff there about clinics as well. But one of the things that I've been trying to promote at the moment is this kind of inter-university and FEE community of practice that, not just sharing within your own university, take that out. So have your share within your university, but then also have a group that shares about UDL and accessibility outside that, where you can pull up, you can see best practice of what's happening in UCC, what's happening in UIG, what's happening in UCD. So you have an idea of what's going on. And again, that all feeds back into, a better learning experience for all our students. And for me, the community practice was a great way to share and promote ideas around inclusivity and accessibility. I got to, talk about captioning and creating accessible education material and putting it under that UD umbrella. And I think having that CP opportunities, it's not just a case of, here's some videos. Sometimes you need that interaction, especially with some people that wouldn't necessarily be as comfortable with, creating that accessible content. The accessibility band, well, I explained what that is, and I just think that's one thing that isn't getting enough traction. We need to bring up accessibility across the board and not just focus on necessarily digital. I think we have a moral and ethical responsibility to push it across the board. And then the other, I guess, the last thing that I think we really need to talk about is, more research in the area of implementation of UDL in higher education, and therefore accessibility. I saw Dara Ryder talk about this recently on social media, but Eddie Byrne's been talking about that for a few years, and so has Murphy. There's a lot of people talking about, the need for implementation, research in the area of implementation of UDL. And I think if we're all proponents of UDL, if we're all taking this UDL badge and implementing it across our universities, then we have an obligation to write up on this, to say what worked out, what didn't work, and whether we share it through research or we share it through communities of practice, we need to share it. Because I go back to Roger Shaw about, the kind of pillars of UDL, about this accessibility, collaboration, community. And for me, that's what we need to work. That triangle of accessibility, collaboration, community is what's going to make UDL work across our different institutions. And when we do make UDL work, we make accessibility work. And that's me. Apologies, I forgot to start my timer, so I have no idea how long I took. But if you have any questions, as I said, you can contact me through various different means. I hope you found that somewhat useful.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was really fascinating, and some really good practical tips as well, which is really great to see. There is actually a question here. So it is from James Northridge. And he says, I wonder if you weren't in that learning group, would have there been much drive for accessibility? I ask in general terms, it seems to come back to somebody from disability needs to be the initial driver, as if it's their job or their role.
That's an interesting question. I don't know, to be quite honest with you. But I do. That is a good point. But I don't know. Like that group was, and what I found when I was working with that group is there was actually a lot more people interested in accessibility than I ever thought. So, like I mentioned, those educational technologists and those academic developers, they actually, when I started doing stuff, they started coming out saying, actually, I'm interested in that. I want to know more about that. And, they're interested in doing stuff around UDL badge facilitation. There is definitely more interest there. And it's just, maybe it does come out of Disability House, but for me, that group showed that there's more of it there. It's just about a case of breaking down those silos, because I said the silos are broken down in terms of, but there's still lots of silos, and we still have people doing work on kind of UDL in bubbles without realizing that there's someone else already doing that work. And again, so, but for me, that comes from senior management about, how we put it into our strategy, how that goes into our teaching and learning, and how that's embedded across our campus. So that's why, it's a much bigger thing in it, but it involves, and with COVID and people not being present, sometimes I think some over that has slipped through the crack, but it also has provided this kind of caveat to address accessibility more and to say, like, this was always an issue that you had, but now that we're online, it's even more important. Yes, kind of, that answers your question. I'm not sure it does, James.
And Thomas, I was just wondering myself, what kind of benefits would you have taken from the last year from COVID of like us moving, we have to be online, that hopefully in September we get to maybe have that more hybrid approach? What do you see going forward would be the best practice?
Yeah, see, the hybrid approach always interests me, because for me that's a concern, because I know certain students that won't be able to come on campus, and I like not giving, saying hybrid for some people who, you know, it's going to be quite difficult. For me, it's pushing on with this accessibility, and not because the Web Accessibility Directive is promoting us. We have I keep coming back to this moral and ethical responsibility, but we do, like why would you want to create stuff that excludes any sort of group? And yeah, you won't have as much, but the idea is the universities need to think about how we make this sustainable. And it's all well and good saying, you know, have UDL included in our policy, more inclusive practice, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, but, you know, it's easy to say these things, it's not that easy to follow through with them. So there's, you know, you have to put their money where your mouth is and put the resources in place. You need to show, you know, how you're going to make this sustainable over time. And it's not a case of, oh, that costs money. You know, you're talking about, you can't be promoting people into EDI positions if you're not willing to just follow that up with, you know, more inclusive practice, more, you know, supporting more diverse groups. Because as I said, for me, in terms of accessibility, it's not disability related. It's about supporting everybody, and it naturally fits under the universal design umbrella, because as I said, I've been using, every time I turn on Netflix, anything I turn on has captions on straight away. I never would watch anything without captions if they're there, like, you know.
Yeah, I think that was a really good point that you made earlier, that it's not just for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. I think a lot of people assume that, but absolutely for people who, you know, English isn't their first language, or people who are dyslexic, or just in general, if you know, you want to have that a little bit lower. If you're watching something, you know what I mean, like that captions can actually improve the experience for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just check here, see if there's any other questions. Yeah, James Norris just said, yeah, I see that we need to move away from the term accessibility to one of inclusive design.
Absolutely. And that was one of the things as well, as about, we were having a discussion yesterday about accessibility, moving it, changing it, dropping the ability and talking about access, and then talking about it in the greater thing, rather than, because of that, like, we shouldn't have to, I don't know. It's a funny conversation to be having, because it's like, for me, it becomes, that's a bit of an attitudinal barrier that should not exist in the first place. And trying to, yeah, I don't know, sometimes even when we mention inclusive, even the inclusive part of that, I don't know. People find terminology weird, and what they associate it with can sometimes impact about how they commit or how they engage with it. But for me, going forward, if we're talking about this as a proper thing, UDL accessibility, it has to come out of our mainstream kind of teaching and learning body. And I think that's where it will come out of.
Absolutely. I think language is so powerful. And I do think that we have a lot of preconceived ideas when we hear a word or we hear a particular term, you know, and even James actually just said here in the comments that in general, folks seem to see accessibility equals ramp. If you think of it like, oh, it's, you know, an accessible building, but accessibility means so much more than that.
Yeah, I've seen accessibility used in all manners of ways that, like, I always have to, I'm like, this kind of running joke where, you know, anybody mentions the word accessibility and I almost pop through the door, you know, but like people, I have to always ask for clarification. They're like, oh, we put this up, everything's accessible. I go, sorry, what do you mean when you say accessible? Yeah. You mean I can get access to it, or that anybody can get access to it, you know? And, you know, I still think there's, but like, you can only do this. So we're doing stuff at the moment with our, say, marketing and communications group, where we're talking about just simple things like emails and social media, saying, look, like, we sent out guidelines, they necessarily weren't followed. So now it's about, you know, offering these kind of CPD, these opportunities for people to actually engage in it. Even the fault about how you set up your email, about the font that comes with it, if you're using things like Outlook, you know, start thinking about these things, because they're simple fixes and they make a lot. And like, I because I've been around in higher education for a while, I can, most university I can think of have people, staff employed, that use things like screen readers. So yeah, this thing where we don't need, or we don't, that's that argument. And even if it isn't, it just makes things more accessible to everybody, whether you want to search a document, whether you just want to engage, because, you know, some of the imagery that I see inside in some emails and stuff like that. It's quite difficult to analyze at the best times. So, and some of them aren't even related to accessibility, like, you know.